At some point, most people arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion about themselves. They look at the gap between what they intended to do and what they actually did. They examine the pattern of strong starts that faded, the commitments that dissolved quietly over time, the ambitions that never quite translated into sustained action. And they reach for the most available explanation. They call themselves lazy. It is a word that carries a specific kind of weight, not just as a description of behavior, but as a verdict on character. To call yourself lazy is to locate the problem inside yourself, in something fundamental and not easily changed. It is to conclude that the gap between intention and action exists because something essential is missing, some quality of drive, discipline, or motivation that other people seem to have and you do not. That conclusion is not only discouraging. In most cases, it is also inaccurate. What behavioral psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and decades of research on human motivation consistently suggest is something more specific and more useful than a character verdict. They suggest that the behaviors most people label as laziness are, in the majority of cases, the predictable output of specific cognitive patterns, patterns that develop through experience, that are maintained through environmental conditions, and that can, with the right understanding and the right approach, be gradually and meaningfully shifted. This is not a reframe designed to remove personal responsibility. Quite the opposite. Understanding the specific cognitive mechanisms behind low motivation, avoidance behavior, and the gap between intention and action is what makes genuine, lasting change in those patterns more possible, not less. Responsibility without accurate understanding tends to produce guilt and self-criticism rather than productive behavioral change. Accurate understanding, paired with honest accountability, is what tends to produce something more useful. This session works through the specific cognitive patterns that research most consistently associates with what people commonly call laziness, what they actually are, how they develop, how they are maintained, and what the evidence suggests about how they can be addressed. Not through willpower alone, not through motivational pressure, through a more accurate understanding of what is actually happening, and a more structurally sound approach to changing it. Part 1. What is actually happening when motivation disappears? The experience of low motivation is so common and so widely recognized that it tends to be treated as self-explanatory. You either feel motivated or you do not. When you do, action follows. When you do not, it does not. And the absence of motivation gets attributed, in most people's internal accounting, to some personal deficiency, insufficient drive, insufficient discipline, insufficient character. But this explanation, while intuitive, skips over something important. Motivation is not a fixed resource that some people have more of than others. It is a cognitive and neurological state, one that is produced by specific conditions, maintained by specific patterns, and disrupted by specific factors that are, in principle, identifiable and addressable. Understanding what those conditions, patterns, and factors are changes the practical question from how do I find more motivation to what specific conditions are currently preventing motivation from being produced, which is a significantly more useful and actionable question. Research on motivation and self-regulation consistently identifies several specific mechanisms that determine whether motivational states are reliably produced or reliably suppressed. The most practically significant of these are worth examining in detail. The reward prediction mechanism. The brain's motivational system is fundamentally organized around the anticipation of reward. When the cognitive system predicts that a given action will produce a valued outcome, it tends to generate the motivational state that initiates and sustains that action. When the cognitive system does not predict a valued outcome, or when it predicts that the effort required will outweigh the anticipated reward, it tends not to generate that motivational state. This is not a malfunction. It is the system operating exactly as it is designed to operate. The problem arises when the reward prediction mechanism is miscalibrated, when it consistently underestimates the value of outcomes associated with effortful, long-term pursuits, and consistently overestimates the value of outcomes associated with immediate, low-effort alternatives. This miscalibration is not random. It tends to develop through a specific pattern of experience. Repeated exposure to environments where immediate rewards are reliably available and long-term rewards are uncertain or delayed. Over time, the cognitive system learns to weight immediate rewards heavily and long-term rewards lightly, a pattern that researchers sometimes describe as steep temporal discounting. When this pattern is established, it produces exactly the behavioral signature that most people label as laziness: strong preference for low-effort, immediately rewarding activities, avoidance of effortful activities whose rewards are delayed or uncertain, difficulty initiating tasks that require sustained engagement without immediate payoff. The behavior is not the product of a character deficiency. It is the predictable output of a reward prediction system calibrated to the wrong timescale. The effort outcome expectancy mechanism. Alongside the reward prediction system, motivation is significantly influenced by what researchers call outcome expectancy, the degree to which a person expects their effort to actually produce the intended result. When outcome expectancy is high, when a person genuinely believes that sustained effort in a given direction will produce meaningful results, motivation tends to be more reliably generated and more reliably sustained. When outcome expectancy is low, when a person's background assessment is that effort in this direction probably will not produce meaningful results regardless of how hard they try, motivation tends to be suppressed even in the presence of genuine desire for the outcome. Low outcome expectancy is not always irrational. Sometimes it reflects an accurate assessment of a situation, but in many cases, it reflects a learned pattern, the accumulated effect of past experiences where effort did not produce the expected results, generalized inappropriately to new situations where the conditions are actually different. This generalized low outcome expectancy is one of the most significant and most underrecognized contributors to the motivational patterns that people label as laziness. It looks like lack of effort. It feels like lack of motivation, but its actual source is a background cognitive assessment, often not consciously held, that effort probably will not be worth it. Part 2. How cognitive patterns around effort develop over time. Neither steep temporal discounting nor low outcome expectancy appears fully formed. Both develop through a specific process, one that is worth understanding clearly, because understanding the development process is what illuminates where and how the pattern can be interrupted. The development process is, at its core, a learning process. The brain is continuously building predictive models about how the world works, including how effort, reward, and outcome tend to relate to each other in the specific environments the person has encountered. These models are updated constantly based on new experience, but they are not updated neutrally. They are updated in ways that tend to weight confirming evidence more heavily than disconfirming evidence, particularly once a pattern has been established. This means that once a pattern of low outcome expectancy or steep temporal discounting is sufficiently established, it tends to be self-reinforcing. The person expects effort to be unrewarding, so they invest less effort. The reduced effort produces reduced results. The reduced results confirm the expectation. The expectation is strengthened. The cycle continues. Breaking this cycle is possible, but it requires understanding that the cycle is maintained by a cognitive pattern, not by a fixed characteristic of the person, and that cognitive patterns respond to evidence. Specifically, they respond to accumulated behavioral evidence that is inconsistent with the existing pattern. This is one of the reasons that behavioral approaches to motivation, approaches that focus on specific behavioral changes rather than on internal attitudinal change, tend to produce more reliable results than purely internal approaches. Changing what you think about motivation is less effective than changing what you do, and allowing the accumulated evidence of what you did to gradually update what you think. There is another developmental factor worth examining: because it tends to be underemphasized in most discussions of motivation. That factor is the role of the environment in maintaining motivational patterns. Most motivational frameworks focus primarily on internal factors, beliefs, mindset, attitude, self-talk. These are real and relevant, but they exist within and are significantly shaped by the external environment in which a person operates daily. An environment that makes low-effort, immediately rewarding behaviors highly accessible and effortful, long-term behaviors relatively inaccessible, tends to produce and maintain steep temporal discounting. Not because the person in that environment is weaker or less disciplined than people in different environments, but because the environment is doing most of the work of maintaining the pattern. This means that environmental design, the deliberate arrangement of the conditions under which behavior occurs, is not a peripheral consideration in addressing motivational patterns. It is, in many cases, one of the most leveraged points of intervention available. Part 3. The specific role of identity in motivational patterns. Beyond the reward prediction and outcome expectancy mechanisms, there is a third factor that research on motivation consistently identifies as highly significant, and that tends to be the least amenable to direct, immediate change. That factor is identity. Specifically, the set of beliefs a person holds about what kind of person they are in relation to effort, discipline, and sustained engagement. These beliefs are not simply attitudes that can be swapped out through a decision. They are deeply embedded cognitive structures that shape behavioral responses in ways that often operate below the level of conscious deliberation. When a person's identity contains a strong characterization of themselves as someone who does not follow through, who gives up when things get hard, who lacks the discipline to sustain effort over time, that characterization functions as a behavioral prediction. The prediction shapes what options are perceived as available, what level of effort seems appropriate for someone like them, and what outcomes seem realistic for someone with their particular history. And behavior tends to conform to the prediction. This is not a mystical process. It is the ordinary operation of the cognitive consistency mechanisms that research in social and cognitive psychology has documented extensively. People behave in ways that are consistent with their self-concept, in part because inconsistency between self-concept and behavior produces a form of cognitive discomfort that the system tends to resolve by adjusting behavior back toward the existing self-concept rather than by updating the self-concept. The practical implication is important and often counterintuitive. Attempting to change identity directly, through affirmations, through internal belief work, through the repetition of positive self-descriptions that are not yet supported by behavioral evidence, tends to be less effective than the alternative approach. The alternative is to change behavior first, deliberately and specifically, in ways that generate the behavioral evidence from which a more accurate and more productive self-concept can gradually be built. This is the behavioral-first approach to identity change that research on self-concept development tends to support. The identity update follows the behavioral evidence. It does not precede it. What this means practically is that the question is not, how do I start believing I am a disciplined person, but what specific, small behavioral commitments can I make and keep that will begin generating the evidence from which a more accurate self-concept can develop? The commitments need to be small enough to be genuinely keepable under current conditions, not aspirationally large commitments that require a level of motivation that is not yet reliably present. The function of these initial commitments is not to produce dramatic results. It is to generate behavioral evidence. That evidence is what gradually updates both the self-concept and the cognitive patterns that the self-concept maintains. Part 4. Why willpower is not the answer, and what tends to work instead. The most common prescription for the motivational patterns described in this session is willpower. Work harder. Push through the resistance. Force yourself to do the things you are avoiding. Develop more discipline. The implication is that the gap between intention and action is primarily a willpower gap, and that willpower, like a muscle, can be developed through repeated application of force against resistance. There is a limited truth in this. Behavioral patterns can change through sustained effort against resistance, and that process does tend to develop something that looks like greater capacity for sustained effort over time. But the willpower framework, applied without the understanding developed in the preceding parts of this session, tends to produce a specific and recognizable failure pattern. The person applies willpower to the problem. For a period, days, sometimes weeks, it works. The behavior changes. The pattern is interrupted. Progress occurs. Then the willpower depletes. Research on what is sometimes called ego depletion, the documented tendency for the capacity for self-regulatory effort to decrease with use within a given period, suggests that willpower is not an unlimited resource. It is a limited one that is consumed by use and restored by rest. When willpower depletes, the behavior tends to revert. The existing cognitive patterns reassert themselves. The environmental cues that maintain the old patterns are still present and still functioning. And the person, having experienced another cycle of strong start and eventual reversion, adds another data point to the accumulating evidence that they are the kind of person who cannot sustain effort, which strengthens exactly the identity pattern that was making the problem worse in the first place. This is the failure cycle that willpower-first approaches tend to produce when they are not paired with the structural and environmental changes that would make sustained behavioral change more possible. What the research on sustained behavioral change tends to support instead is a combination of three elements that work together more reliably than willpower alone. The first is structural design. Rather than relying on willpower to overcome the friction between intention and action in every individual instance, structural design reduces that friction at the source. This means arranging the conditions under which behavior occurs so that the desired behavior is the path of least resistance rather than the path of greatest resistance. It means making the effortful behavior more accessible, reducing the setup cost, creating reliable environmental triggers, embedding the behavior in an established routine so that it requires less active decision-making to initiate. And it means making the competing low-effort behaviors less immediately accessible, increasing the friction required to engage in them, removing or reducing the environmental cues that trigger them. These are not complex interventions, but they work on the conditions that maintain behavioral patterns rather than on the willpower required to override those conditions in each individual instance. And working on conditions tends to be more sustainable than working on override capacity. The second is graduated challenge. One of the specific reasons that motivational patterns are resistant to willpower-based approaches is that the challenges being attempted are often calibrated to an aspired level of performance rather than to the actual current level of the cognitive and motivational systems being engaged. Attempting a large behavioral change from a baseline of established avoidance and low outcome expectancy places those systems under more strain than they are currently capable of sustaining. The strain produces the depletion that produces the reversion. Graduated challenge, starting with behavioral commitments that are small enough to be genuinely sustainable at current baseline capacity, and expanding them incrementally as that capacity develops, works with the motivational system rather than against it. Each successfully completed commitment generates a small amount of the behavioral evidence that begins updating the cognitive patterns maintaining the problem. Each successful completion also tends to produce a modest increase in outcome expectancy because the person has evidence, however small, that effort in this direction produces something. Over time, this graduated approach tends to produce a more durable expansion of motivated behavioral engagement than large initial commitments that exceed current capacity and produce failure experiences that strengthen existing limiting patterns. The third is honest self-monitoring. Research on behavioral self-regulation consistently identifies self-monitoring, the regular, specific tracking of one's own behavior against intended commitments, as one of the more reliable supports for sustained behavioral change. Not self-criticism when the monitoring reveals a gap. Not self-congratulation when it does not. Honest, specific, factual tracking of what was actually done relative to what was committed to, treated as information rather than as verdict. This kind of monitoring serves two functions. First, it maintains accurate awareness of the actual behavioral pattern, which prevents the motivated reasoning that tends to produce overestimation of how consistently commitments are being kept. Second, it creates a feedback loop that makes specific, targeted adjustments to the approach possible, because the specific gaps between intention and action are visible and can be examined for their specific causes. Part 5. The environmental dimension that most people overlook. Of the factors discussed in this session, the environmental dimension is the one most consistently underweight in personal development frameworks and most consistently overweight in the actual determination of behavioral outcomes. The research on behavioral consistency across contexts makes a compelling case for why this matters. Studies examining behavioral patterns across different environmental conditions consistently find that the same person, in different environmental contexts, produces dramatically different behavioral outcomes, not because their character or motivation changed between contexts, but because the environmental conditions changed in ways that either supported or undermined the target behavior. This finding has a specific and practical implication. The behavioral patterns most commonly labeled as laziness are not simply internal to the person exhibiting them. They are, to a substantial and often underappreciated degree, properties of the interaction between the person and their environment. Change the environment, and the behavioral output tends to change, often more readily and more durably than it does in response to internal attitudinal work. The most practically significant environmental factors for the motivational patterns discussed in this session are worth examining specifically. Stimulus control refers to the relationship between environmental cues and the behavioral responses they tend to trigger. Most established behavioral patterns, including avoidance patterns, low-effort habits, and the default behaviors that fill time in the absence of more structured activity, are substantially cue-driven. Specific times of day, specific locations, specific devices, specific social contexts all function as reliable triggers for associated behavioral patterns. Understanding which environmental cues are triggering which behavioral patterns, and deliberately modifying those cues, is one of the most effective environmental interventions available. Removing cues that reliably trigger avoidance or low-effort behavior. Adding cues that reliably trigger the target behavior. Changing the context in which the target behavior is attempted so that it is associated with environmental conditions that support rather than undermine it. Social environment is the second major environmental factor worth examining. The people with whom a person spends the most time tend to establish implicit norms about what levels of effort, engagement, and behavioral standard are expected and accepted. These norms are not typically stated explicitly. They operate through social modeling, through the behavioral expectations embedded in social interactions, and through the degree of accountability or its absence that characterizes the social context. A social environment in which low effort is normalized and high effort is not expected tends to maintain the motivational patterns that produce low effort. A social environment in which higher behavioral standards are modeled and implicitly expected tends to support the development of those standards, not through pressure or criticism, but through the ordinary operation of social norm influence on behavior. This does not mean that changing social environment is easy or always possible, but it does mean that an honest assessment of how the current social environment is influencing the motivational patterns being addressed is a necessary component of any serious attempt to change those patterns. Part 6. What gradual, consistent change actually looks like over time. Nothing in this session suggests that the cognitive patterns associated with low motivation and avoidance behavior are easy to change. They are not. They developed over extended periods through consistent experience, and they tend to be maintained by multiple reinforcing factors. Internal cognitive patterns, identity-level beliefs, environmental conditions, and social norms that do not all shift simultaneously or quickly. What the research does suggest is that these patterns are changeable, gradually, specifically, and through approaches that address the actual mechanisms maintaining them rather than simply applying motivational pressure against them. The realistic picture of what that change looks like over time is worth describing honestly. In the early stages, the changes are small and the evidence of progress is limited. Small behavioral commitments are made and kept. The structural and environmental conditions that have been maintaining avoidance patterns are gradually modified. The cognitive distance between the existing self-concept and a more productive one begins, very slowly, to decrease. Not because the self-concept has been directly changed, but because the behavioral evidence that the self-concept is built from has begun to accumulate in a different direction. This early stage is the most fragile. It is the stage where the motivational patterns being addressed are still most strongly established, where the environmental conditions may still be only partially modified, and where the behavioral evidence accumulated is still insufficient to have produced significant updates in the cognitive patterns or the self-concept. It is also the stage where willpower-based approaches tend to produce their most dramatic early gains, and where, without the structural and environmental support described in this session, those gains tend to revert. In the middle stages, if the structural and environmental modifications have been maintained and the graduated behavioral commitments have been expanded incrementally, something begins to shift in the cognitive pattern. Outcome expectancy, the background assessment of whether effort will produce meaningful results, begins to update. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, as the accumulating behavioral evidence provides a more consistent record of effort producing something. This update in outcome expectancy tends to make motivation more reliably available, not as an always present state, but as something that is generated more readily in response to the cues and conditions associated with the target behavior. The effort required to initiate and sustain the behavior begins, gradually, to decrease. In the later stages, and the realistic timeline for reaching these stages is measured in months rather than days or weeks, the behavioral patterns that were initially effortful and avoidance-prone have begun to establish themselves as more default. The identity-level beliefs associated with them have begun to update toward a more accurate reflection of the accumulated behavioral evidence. The environmental conditions have been modified sufficiently to provide reliable support rather than reliable resistance. At this stage, the motivational patterns look, from the outside, like what most people would call discipline or drive. But they are not the product of exceptional character or unusual willpower. They are the product of specific structural, environmental, and cognitive changes applied consistently over a realistic timescale, with honest self-monitoring and graduated behavioral expansion. The label of laziness, applied at the beginning of this process, was never an accurate description of the person. It was an inaccurate description of a specific set of cognitive and environmental conditions that, with the right understanding and the right approach, turned out to be more changeable than the label suggested. That is the more accurate and more useful conclusion. Not that the person was fine all along and needed no change. Not that the behavioral patterns were someone else's fault or entirely the product of external factors, but that the patterns were specific, understandable, and addressable, and that addressing them effectively required understanding what they actually were rather than simply applying moral judgment to their surface appearance. The understanding is now available. What tends to follow from that understanding, applied with patience and structural honesty over a realistic period of time, is a gradually more functional relationship between intention and action, one that does not require exceptional willpower to maintain, because it has been built on the conditions that make sustained behavioral engagement more naturally possible.